Welcome everyone to the NBCC Brown Bagger series. This is, I can't even remember now. We're getting close to 20 years of these brown baggers, and we may have participants on here that aren't as old as the brown bagger is now. But we do welcome you. We've been still getting good attendance to these, so we will continue to provide these as long as you guys continue to want to have the programming done. So today, the general session that we're looking at for this year's brown bagger is updates on tools and strategies to genetically improve beef cattle, new trait and innovative thoughts on funding. And so we have a couple of new topics today that address this issue, I think, quite well. So this is session 2. As most of you know now, we do this every October on the Wednesdays, and this being the second Wednesday of October, we're in session 2 now. We still do have the website available, and the primary use of this website now is for basically housing and archiving these webinars that we've been doing for so long. And so the website is www.nbcec.org. And you can find these recordings, as well as we do have the sire selection manual that's up. And I just want to, while we're talking about the sire selection manual, let all of you know that we have the 3rd edition is out now, and we got quite a few of the printed versions of that. And for anyone that has an extension need or even a teaching need for these manuals, I am willing to ship to you, courtesy of the Beef Improvement Federation, a box of the manuals for you to distribute. So if you have a desire to distribute some of these sire selection manuals, drop me an email and let me know, and I'll get a box out to you. My email is dbullock@uky.edu. If you need that, put it in the chat, or I might put it in the chat later on, just to make sure if you would like that. My name is Darrh Bullock. I'm at the University of Kentucky, and I am the host for this session. I would like to point out my cohorts are Dr. Bob Weber at Kansas State and Dr. Matt Spangler at the University of Nebraska, and I appreciate all that those guys do. We've been a team on this for quite some time, this and a few other things, actually, so I appreciate those guys a lot. The first speaker that we have on the program today is Kelli Retallick, and bring up your bio here, Kelli. Of course, I got it buried below everything again. Kelli serves as the president of Angus Genetics Incorporated, which is a fully owned subsidiary of the American Angus Association. She drives the mission and guides the research and application of genetic tools for Angus breeders and users of Angus genetics. Kelli obtained a bachelor's degree in animal science from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, a master's degree in animal breeding and genetics at K-State, and is currently working on her PhD. Kelli is no stranger to the brown bagger. I don't know how many times, Kelli, we've had you on now, but it's been a few, so we do appreciate it. We like to give the breed associations opportunities to give us updates from time to time on some of the new traits that they have coming or newly developed, and that's no exception of you joining us today. And going to talk about selection for female fertility and some of the things that Angus is doing currently in this regard in their genetic evaluation. So welcome, Kelli, and I will turn it over to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Darrh. I will wait for there we go. So thank you for that introduction, and thanks for having us on again. We always get excited when we get to share some of the fun and innovative things that we're doing here at Angus. And what we're going to talk about today on this female fertility update is really a new trait, right, that the industry has had, but definitely a new trait for Angus. And so we've kind of been working on a twofold fertility update or update projects. So the first one would be surrounding our heifer pregnancy EPD, and we're not going to talk about that one today. We had a really great intern on staff here this summer, AJ Knowles, who's with the University of Missouri, who's been working with our heifer preg data, and maybe at some point we'll update this group on that as well. But today we really want to focus on the productive life, or the kind of longevity type trait that we've been researching here at the for the American Angus Association through AGI. And so this has been a long-term project that Angus has had their sights set on for quite some time. As many of you know, this is one of those traits where Angus has never really had a tool, right, to select for cows that are going to stay in the herd and produce calves. And partly some of that was probably due to the fact that for a long time we didn't have an inventory-based reporting system. Now we have a voluntary inventory-based reporting system, and we'll talk a little bit about that and the uptake that we've had throughout the American Angus Association membership. I will say, we're getting closer every day to kind of a research implementation of this particular trait, but what we're going to focus on today was really some of those core functions and features of that research that we did leading up to this point. And so if I can find, oh, here we go. So just to kind of give you a little background on kind of the way that works, like I said, this AHIR, Angus Herd Improvement Records, is basically our performance recording program that Dr. Esther McCabe here at the association as the Director of Performance Programs really runs and oversees. And then at AGI, we're tasked to take all that data that she does a really great job of collecting and try to put it into usable tools. And so one of the things that we've been very focused on here at the association for the past few years is this idea of inventory reporting. Again, not a new concept for the industry, but a newer concept for our members here at the American Angus Association. And so this is a voluntary inventory reporting program where there's not kind of a, you're either in this or you're not in performance programs, right? We kind of have our old historical way of reporting that data through that individual reporting, and then we have full enrollments, or kind of, what happens to each cow every single year. So she runs a fall and spring enrollment procedure. This has been around since, 2012 to 2014 is really when it kind of came on board, and we've, with Esther's help, have been able to kind of reinvigorate this program and really started to gain some traction here in the recent years. And so that number there below, we have just under 100,000 females enrolled on our inventory reporting, which is definitely a great number. However, I know we're really candid about the fact that we want to keep driving this home to our members. The more whole herd inventory reporting data, as a lot of you researchers know, that we can have, the less assumptions we have to make about those cows that are outside of the system. And so that's something that we've really been trying to, with the help of Esther, push that message out to that membership. And some of the things that we've tried to do, rather than to have a big stick, try to put some carrots out there. And one of the things that you can see on this screen that Esther's worked to do is actually to get that Maternal Plus designation badge kind of on the online pedigree lookup that kind of recognizes these herds that are in this inventory reporting, because this is really the key data, right, that we're using to try to drive home some of these records. So what we're going to have today and talk a little bit about is some published work that we have out there that was actually done by Miss Hinia, Dr. Hinia Oliveira. She now works at Lactanet, but she was a postdoc student with Flavio Schenko at the University of Guelph, and she did a lot of, I'm going to say, a lot of the grunt work to try to start us down this track towards longevity in North American Angus cattle. And so we can't thank her enough for all the work that she's done and really the guidance that she's lent us. This has been an ongoing project. I think we launched with Hinia here in 2019, and we're getting a little bit closer to the finish line now here that we're at the end of 2022. So sorry, I'm just having a little trouble. Sometimes these arrows don't show up quite as fast. So just to kind of give you a little background about the data that we're using to design this functional longevity EPD. In this particular data set, we're really researching, what data should be used, the variance components, heritabilities, et cetera. What models should we frankly really use? We are using cows that were born after 1990 in the American Angus Association database, and they must have calved between before 30 months of age and had to have a minimum age at first calving of 19 months. So Obviously, just a lot of data cleaning procedures there to try to make this data set the best it can be for some of those core parameter estimation functions. The maximum culling age in this data set was 20 years, but we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. We spent a lot of time on figuring out, where should we cut off that age range to allow us to have the best individual evaluation. So in total, we had about 500,000 records from the US and about 77, just under 80,000 records from Canada. So this is a North American genetic evaluation, as some of you know, and I know Kajal's on the call. The American and Canadian Angus evaluations actually run together. And so it was a no-brainer to kind of work on this research together, specifically because Canada has a whole herd, mandatory whole herd inventory reporting system that's been in place for quite some time. So like I just told you, in the American Angus inventory system, there's only 97,000 animals. Obviously, 500,000 is quite a bit more than that. So what we're basically doing is, because we're starting with cows born after 1990, we're not only leveraging animals that are inside of that inventory-based system, but we're also trying to leverage records that are on the outside of that program. And we're doing that through the tracking of those individual records, how they've been submitted internally here to the association. And so we did make that choice to try to travel down this road because, quite frankly, we haven't had inventory reporting all that long. It's about 10 years old now. So just the sheer magnitude and massive data that's collected in there. And not only that, but the number of cows that have been in that system for a long period of time is limited just because of the age of that program in general. So we're really trying to reach back and use as much physical data as we possibly can to try to leverage a really good tool out into the industry. So just to give you a little background on some of the different culling code classes that we had in this original data set, you can look through there, and I'm sure a lot of you that work with breed associations and genetic evaluations would have similar codes in your database. Some of those have far more records than others. From that standpoint, some of that is due to the fact that some of those culling codes came on a little bit later in time than others were just added. For example, rectal prolapse has been added within the past, just prior to 2019, when we would have pulled this particular data set for Hinian to use. And as you go down there, we've kind of classified and grouped those into basically 6 different classes, with the natural death, the structural problems, disease, fertility, performance. And then we have this time-old miscellaneous category, right, that I'm sure kind of riddles some other breed association databases, but that is our largest culling code criteria. Some of that is due to the fact that when we did start inventory reporting, specifically as the culled as miscellaneous with the 44,000 records, a lot of that was herd inventory cleanup. And so we had, herds out there that, had cows on there from 1972. Obviously, those cows weren't still alive, but they had never culled them off of their inventory because there really was no reason to. We've done some systematic updates from an association perspective that Jared Cassidy has led, where after a certain amount of time, we'll cull them and parse them out internally ourselves. But from that standpoint, some of those culled miscellaneouses, I just want to point that out. A lot of that is due to the fact that we're cleaning up those cow herds. So altogether, we had about 604,000 culling codes that we were able to utilize in this as well. So just to kind of give you guys a little bit of background on the average number of cows here that have been culled over time. So basically, you can go look through there. Age at culling. We have about 10% of our cows, right, that are getting culled at 2 years of age. So you can kind of look across there and see how cumulatively, right, that adds together as we go throughout time. You can also see here that for this particular analysis, like I said, we only included for variance component estimation 2 through 15 years of age as we were starting to step down these models. And we actually, as you'll see later, have ratcheted that down a little bit more just based on the sheer amount of records, right, that are out there on those far ends. With that, kind of just to look at it a little bit differently, to see how many animals were culled and how many calves they had reported to the American Angus Association during that time. This isn't necessarily registered animals, but just were reported. So we would have a lot of what we would call our beef improvement record cattle or BIR cattle, where basically they are just individual animals that were reported but weren't taken on to be registered. So you can see that 20% of the individuals that were utilized in this particular data set, that 20% of them were culled after their first, and only recorded one calving in our herd book. And as you look through there, you can kind of see how that, kind of mimics what we saw before based on culling age of those cows. But this is the number of calvings that each one of those different age groups had in this particular data set. So just to kind of give you a sense of the information that we're working with and how we're utilizing some of those records. So now we're getting into a little bit more of the nitty gritty kind of heritability components and what does this trait really look like and how should we kind of set our age parameters and things like that. So what she was able to do is she took all of those different structural codes, or excuse me, those different culling codes, and I apologize, I didn't put a letter on here, but those different culling codes, and basically estimated a heritability for longevity for each one of those. So whether that was structural problems, right, whether that was disease, whether that was that miscellaneous code, quite frankly, or all reasons together, you can see that we had variable heritabilities based on the trait of interest. And so some of these high heritability estimates that you're going to see up at the top, and I don't know if you can see my pointer, but basically some of those high heritability estimates, those are going to be more of your structural traits. You come down here, and I just put this red line here at 0.1 just to kind of give you guys a little bit of a kind of guide as you're looking across those. You can kind of see that basically our all reasons code is going to be the solid line that's kind of hidden in there, but that's really coming out around just under about a 10% combined heritability over time, which is fairly similar to what a lot of the literature we read. I know Red Angus is right around a 10% heritability for their stability EPD, if I do recall. So to try to break it down a little bit more, those graphs get pretty busy. Basically what we went through is we said this all column, that's basically 2 through 15 years of age. And like I said, we ratcheted that down a little bit more, and we actually just looked at 3 to 12 years of age as well. Just to kind of compare, right, how does that affect our overall heritability? How much more genetic variance can we capture if we're kind of cleaning up those ends of our data and of our subsets of data? And as you go through there, you can see that the pattern, as you look across these two columns, we lower our standard errors a little bit. We ratchet up our heritability components a tad, but not really much. And then cumulatively, we don't really see that much of a difference when we dump all of those culling codes into basically, are you there, or are you not? That's what that all means, right? So instead of saying, did you get called for natural death? And basically estimating the heritability of, if I die of a natural death, that's a 17% heritability for longevity. Basically, we combine all those culling codes, and we actually land at a 9% heritability, regardless if we're using all of the data or we're using the 3 through 12 years. But I think it becomes more interesting when we go back to this graph and we start to look at, okay, in these end years, 11 through 15 years of age, this is where we start to see quite a bit of vibration, or a little bit probably more noise in our data sets. You can see, for instance, we have some of these heritabilities for these different individual culling codes that kind of start to spike right near the end, some of those things. And so that tells me that there's probably not enough poor data there. And if you remember how many cows, right, you kind of remember those graphs we showed earlier, that we have a really low percentage of cows that get culled at those different years, that if we are, really trying to capture the full genetic variance, that probably is leading to a little bit of instability. The other thing I think that's important to point out here, and it's been important for our breeders to start to try to kind of think through and fixate their mind on, is that once we get to some of these, 5, 6, 7 years of age, our heritability, especially for the combined, really starts to level out. And so if you can kind of see that solid line there, it really starts to level out, and we see the same thing happen when we plot our genetic variants. And so once we get to 5, 6, 7 years of age, we've really kind of basically captured the maximum amount of genetic variation that we're going to get out of this particular trait with the data that we have to work with. And so that's one thing where we get asked that question a lot from breeders, and there's probably some breeders on the call that are thinking the same thing. Well, I'm turning generation intervals very quickly. You know, I don't keep cows to 10 years of age. I don't keep cows to 12 years of age. So, you know, how can we do a good enough job of predicting this functional longevity in those contemporary groups where there's a lot of that kind of early culling for genetic progress? And the one thing that I think this supports is that even if they are turning their generation intervals at 5 or 6 years of age, that we're capturing quite a bit of genetic variance of this particular trait once we're getting to that point anyways. And so while not perfect, right, obviously we'd like everybody, you know, the whole contemporary group to, you know, the longest ones to stay in for 10 years of age so we can really see those true differences. Really at this point in time, though, based on the data that we see, we're capturing primarily most of the genetic variance by the time we get there anyways. So we are still ratcheting down our production model. So as we went through this process, we really, you know, obviously we had this core work done, and then we really had to start thinking as we start to present this to the membership, what's really going to be the best unit of measurement that's going to allow them to be able to take that and really utilize it in their breeding programs. And so we have been working through this kind of predicted number of cumulative calves over this female's lifetime. We're working with the University of Georgia to finish this work up, because one of the things with, especially with the random regression model, which we are targeting for this functional longevity work, as I'm sure many on this call can attest, is that they do take quite a bit of time at some points to converge. And so, as you know, the American Angus Association runs a Friday to Friday, a weekly genetic evaluation. So we're really trying to make sure that the model that we have is the best model we can put out there, and that we can deliver, right, those selection tools in a manner that's gonna not create an issue for our membership as they're, you know, trying to make mating decisions or trying to market their bulls, those sorts of things, that we can really keep it to that week-to-week turnaround time. And so as we go through this work, that's kind of the part where we're still trying to get across the finish line on that one, to make sure that at the end of the day, we have this really good tool that people can intuitively use, learn, and apply in their own production scenarios. Another really important note that we're talking a lot about with our membership as well, just like I'm sure many of you have, is that while we think of productive life, or we think of longevity, and we really are focused on the female, right? Because those are the females, right, that are going to have to be productive over their lifetime. That when we think about it from a genetic improvement standpoint, with a heritability of around 10% or just under 10% in our case, that this, unfortunately, you're going to have a female that probably stays in the herd for 10 years, has, you know, calves every single year, but maybe she doesn't have the best longevity EPD in the breed, because those individual culmination of records on that female with a 10% heritability, unfortunately, that's just the nature of the beast. So we really have been trying to drive home the point that this isn't about the individual cow as much as it's about the aggregate information provided by a sire's daughters, and really being able to drive genetic improvement like we've, you know, a lot of individuals have done for decades upon decades, the genetic improvement by identifying the sire lines and identifying those genetic lines that have the potential to leave cows in the herd longer and more productive. And so as we move into kind of the final stage of what we're going to ratchet down for a model and kind of report out to the membership, we will roll this out in what we call our research EPD format. This is something that from a breed association perspective, I think American Angus has quite a bit of success on. They've done it with some of their newer traits, you know, foot score, hair shed, some of those newer traits that have been added to the pedigree here recently. It allows us to present these research EPDs in a manner that, for those producers who have been participating and focusing on a trait like longevity, without that genetic tool, can have some time to understand that trait better, even give feedback to the association about what they're seeing, those sorts of things. And with that research EPD format, basically we report two things. We'll report AI sires with a certain amount of accuracy to the trait. That'll be a public list that will go up on the association website, and anybody can basically utilize that, for their searches or to make their selection decisions and things like that. And then individual cow herds that are enrolled on that inventory reporting system that we talked about will also receive research EPDs on their individual cow herds. So definitely kind of a call to individuals that are out there to get involved in that inventory reporting system so that you can kind of get ahead of the curve. And then finally, one of the things that we need to do once we have this EPD in place, and if we target a production release for hopefully next summer, we'll also simultaneously work to fit this trait inside of the maternal weaned calf value, which would be Angus's kind of maternal index, but it does include weaning weight and some of those things. So not a strictly replacement heifer index, but that maternal weaned calf value and subsequently that combined value, which is kind of total profitability throughout the supply chain. So with that, I'm going to close there, and I'm sure that we have plenty of time for some questions.
Absolutely. So if anybody has any questions, if you would, please put those in I guess there's a question and answer little tab. If you could put those in there, then we'll get those to Kelli. And while you guys are typing, I have a couple, I guess, for you, Kelli, if I could. Yeah. So it's interesting, and I think if I understood correctly in terms of what this EPD will look like, the unit will be calves. Is that correct? And so if we have say a 2-unit difference in the EPD, that means that the bull with the higher value, his daughters on average would expect to give you 2 more calves over her lifetime of productivity. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what we're targeting. And as you know, in a random regression model, right, you're going to have that fixed estimate, right? And it's going to be a deviation from that fixed estimate. And so based on what the population is, let's say our population right now, 7-year-old gives us on average 5 calves, right? Then you're going to have a deviation from that point in time. But that is our target. The cumulative calf model, and actually this kind of piggybacks off of Matt Spangler's question that he put in there about donor dams. The problem that we're kind of running up against, and this is actually the final question that we have, is that it's a bit harder to censor the data when we have that cumulative calf model, because you kind of have to base it on the probability of, on those censored animals, the probability of how many calves will she have over a lifetime once you set them to missing. Where in the traditional random regression model, it seems to be maybe a tick more straightforward. And so that's one thing that we are running up against in the issue that we're still trying to work through.
And basically just the random regression model that allows us to not have to wait till the cow dies to know how many calves she's going to give us, or to be able to estimate exactly how many calves she's going to give us. So it enables this data to be able to go into the system earlier, basically.
Right. So we're not waiting, let's say our cutoff is at 10 years of age. We're not waiting for 10 years to then, okay, now the whole contemporary group can go in, but we can utilize the information over time. Exactly.
Okay, great. Michael Schultz out of South Africa is saying it appreciates it, and they can use this information for sure. So this is going to be the tougher question, and you'll probably be mad at me for asking. So what's the time frame? What are you thinking on this in terms of when do you expect to release?
Yeah, so we're going to try to have that research EPD release out before the end of 2022. And so that would then go into that research format. And then if we can stay on track, and if we do get it out by the end of 2022, we're going to work hard to try to move it into a production format, which at that point, it's really not hard to move it in production format, but that's going to be the modeling around $M. We would like those things to go simultaneously, right? Instead of kind of delayed a delayed release. And so we're targeting for next kind of midsummer for a production release of this particular trait.
Great.
So
I've got a question for you. So the question is, what is the difference compared to the stability EPD value?
Yeah, so stability EPD in the traditional sense, like the traditional stability model, from my understanding that Warren Snelling would have created, it was, did you show up at 2 and did you show up at 5, right? In kind of that traditional sense. Now, when I look at some of the newer kind of stability models, I do believe that someone like the Red Angus Association that kind of labels theirs as a stability is using a random regression model. And I also believe that Hereford is using a random regression model in a sense too with their sustained cow fertility. So they would be actually quite similar to those newer models. Basically, we're utilizing some of the work that came out of the Canadian Simmental Association. Actually, our previous research director would have been a co-author on that paper, and that is a similar the similar type model that we're trying to utilize.
So I think the other thing to point out, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of you other guys that are smarter than me, but if I understand right, stability is based on a percentage of daughters that are expected to both calve before and after. In other words, that remain in the herd for that longer period of time. So the unit is different in that regard, and that it's a percentage of daughters that you would expect to have that longevity. So, any other questions? If you guys could type those in really quick. And also, I tell you what, why don't we go ahead and move on, Kelly, and you're going to stick around with us. And so if we have any more questions pop in for you, will you be around to be able to answer those at the end?
Sure, that sounds good.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to move on. Let me see if I can get control of this thing. So our next speaker is, we have an unusual treat. We have a speaker out of Australia, and as most of you may know, it is in the wee hours of the morning in Australia, and so we didn't ask Dr. Banks to come on live with us. We asked him if he would do a recording, and he agreed. And so we're going to go into a recording here in just a minute. I want to tell you, so you might be trying to figure out how to do it, is that you need to be upping your volume a little bit, because the volume on the recording is a little bit low. So if you might be wanting to look into that if you would. All right, so just to give you a little introduction on Rob, Dr. Rob Banks got his PhD in animal breeding from the University of New England, and he's currently a professor there at the University of New England. He has over 33 years of experience in developing and implementing genetic evaluations and improvement systems for both sheep and cattle and various other species. He's had a significant role in the research and development strategy and management, working with the Meat and Livestock Australia. Most recently, he's the most recent past director of AGBU, which is the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit based at the University of New England. And this is the group that basically does the R&D for Breed Plan, which is the genetic evaluation system that they have in Australia. Rob has maintained an interest in the challenges around industry-wide implementation of genomic selection and the economic contributions of genetic improvement more generally. And we asked Rob to do this. Matt and I both saw Rob at the World Genetics Congress give a topic, give this a paper on this very topic, and it was very interesting, and it looks a little bit deeper in that about, you know, how we could possibly share the burden that a lot of breeders take on in terms of the early developers of this genomics information, and how we could possibly distribute that over a wider group. And so, like I say, be ready to turn up your volume, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Banks. If you have it, we're going to have his email up at the end. If you have any questions, you can email him directly, or you can put it in the question and answer section, and we will get it to him. But be sure and put your email address in there so that we can get a response back to you. So here we go with Dr. Banks.
Good afternoon. My name's Rob Banks. I recently stepped down as Director of the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit in Armidale. Many of you will know Steve Miller, who's now in that role doing a great job. Well, I was there up until when Steve started. I've worked in genetic improvement in Australia in a number of industries for quite a long time, and particularly in my time in AgBoo, we've been heavily involved in the implementation of genomic selection in a range of industries, and that's stimulated me to do quite a bit of thinking about how to get the right sort of phenotyping to make sure we get the best out of genomic selection, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, and I really appreciate the opportunity or the invitation. I'm going to touch on, first of all, genomic selection, what changes. Secondly, some challenges that I think apply particularly to the beef, and also the sheep industries, but I'll be talking about beef. Some challenges that will have impacts on what we can achieve with genetic improvement and particularly genomic improvement. Then a couple of significant questions that I've looked into. Firstly, the level of investment. What are the questions about that? What are the options we have? And secondly, are there ways that we could share the costs of investment in phenotyping for genomic selection? And finish off with some thoughts about prospects and opportunities for the industry utilising genomic selection. So to me, the key change under genomic selection is that we decouple or potentially decouple recording or the collecting of phenotypes from actually carrying out selection. Typically under BLUP and earlier methods, a person would be doing some recording of their cattle, weighing them, whatever, and also making selection decisions about them. Under genomic selection, those decisions can be completely separated, and they can even be carried out by different people or groups of people. And so you got an opportunity where we can split the roles of, say, recording and selecting and marketing, which previously tended to be combined into one breeder or typically breeder family. And also I think we're going to see a lot more thought about what the breeding goal is, because it becomes really clear that you simply have to have phenotypes to support genomic selection, and so you need to think about what traits you should be recording. So just to touch on some of the challenges around the beef industry. As I've said, they're quite similar in sheep, but I'm going to be concentrating on beef. For genetic improvement and for genomic selection. And firstly, there's considerable diversity within the industry, particularly the breeding sector, in terms of firstly the scale of operation. So you've got some people might only have 10 or 20 or 30 cows, all the way up to have people running thousands of breeding cows. Secondly, in the recording effort that people are making. So some people might be just recording weaning weight, for instance, all the way through to people who are recording a whole range of weights. They might be recording ultrasound measurements, they'll be recording fertility, etc., etc. So you've got quite a lot of diversity in recording effort, and you also get quite a lot of diversity in the selection applied, both in the direction, what people are selecting for, and also how hard they're selecting. They've got enormous diversity within the beef industry in terms of its breeding. There's also limited value chain integration. By that I mean you don't have the situation where, for instance, the packing company owns the breeding operation, or the retailer owns the breeding operation. They're completely separate businesses typically, whereas that's not the case obviously in some industries like pork and poultry. Now, one of the consequences of particularly of those two facts is that you tend to get recording mainly being on things that are easy to measure, which I've called ETM, and by which I mean things like weaning weight, for instance, or yearling weight. And I've thought about how we should basically characterise traits in terms of what we might phenotyping according to the two dimensions of, first of all, is it easy or hard to record them, which I think is typically their cost. predominantly. If you cost your labour, then it's clearly cost. So cost of recording, either low or high. And secondly, the value of the trait to the value chain. So whether it's high or low. Now, if it's low, it's really hard to see why people are recording a trait. There are circumstances which you might do that, but in general, it's not going to be worth recording. When the trait is of high value, then really you've just got a rather simple distinction between whether it's easy to measure, cost of recording is low, or whether it's hard to measure. Now, that's just a very simple way of thinking about the difference between hard to measure and easy to measure. The typical outcomes we get in the beef industry from those circumstances I've just outlined, within the BLUP era, in general, the outcomes for individual businesses, individual studs, individual bull breeders, I think approximately reflect the individual effort that's made. So people who don't record very much, in broad terms, don't get as much back out of bull sales, for instance, as people who record more animals or more traits. People who select harder and in more valuable directions will, in general, get better returns. And from an industry or a breed perspective, also, the population will typically make progress at lower than the potential rates. Now, these things are going to change in the genomics era. I think phenotyping effort is more and more likely to going to reflect market signals, but we clearly know that genomic accuracy will depend on the distribution of phenotyping, by which I mean what the scale is, how many animals we're recording, and also what traits we record. So that leads me to this question, which I've thought about and which I'll be talking about, how to maximise profit from genetic improvement using genomic selection. And I think of this as an investment problem, what to invest in other words, what traits should we record? Secondly, how much to invest, what's the scale of recording, how many animals are we going to record? And then thirdly, how do we fund that investment, because the records aren't free. And I've looked at this in two ways. One is by modelling the profit from recording, and the second is looking at developing a method of sharing the costs, and I'll go through those briefly now. Firstly, to model the profit from recording, I've simply imagined a situation where we've got two traits, and one is an easy to measure trait and one is a hard to measure trait, and you can see up here the easy to measure trait has a heritability of 0.3, the hard to measure is 0.1. The easy to measure trait is costing us $1 per record, and at least initially the hard to measure trait was modelling at $5 per record, and their relative economic values were $1 and $5 respectively. And I've looked at the scenarios with a range of genetic correlations between the traits. You'll see that in a minute. Now, I've then set up a situation where I simply calculate response to selection for the two traits. When I vary accuracy from very low to very high, I've used this software MT Index, which Julius van der Werf has developed, to do that. And so basically I've simply said, righto, I'll have a certain small number of records for trait 1 and a certain small number of records for trait 2, and then I increase the number of records for trait 1, I increase the number of records for trait 2. So they basically cover all combinations of accuracy for the two traits. I then calculate the records needed to generate that level of accuracy. This is genomic accuracy, not the same as BIF accuracy, but basically for every combination of numbers of records for the two traits, I calculate the accuracy and back calculate the number of records I needed to get that. Because I know the costs of recording, I can then model an implementation. So we've got our accuracy, we can predict the response to selection up here using MT Index. And for each combination, we know the number of records for each trait, so we can calculate the cost of our reference population, and then we can harvest the returns from selection over a commercial sector. I've modelled that over harvesting those returns over 5 years, so it's 5 years of production, and I've also varied the commercial scale, so from relatively small to large. So I'll go through this reasonably quickly, but that's basically it. I've just varied the accuracy for each of the traits, so I do all combinations from low to high accuracy. Here's an example of the responses to selection depending on the accuracy of the two traits. And as I said, this is using MT index. In this case, the correlation between the traits, genetic correlation between the traits is 0. Across the top here, you can see, first of all, this is the number of records that I've got for trait 2. This is animals that are genotyped and phenotyped, ranging from 1,280 up to 128,000. Those are the corresponding accuracies in that row. So you can see it goes from just on 0.16 up to 0.85. And same sort of thing for trait 1. This is the number of records I've got for trait 1. This is the accuracy for trait 1. And for every single combination, the value in the shaded area is the response to the index selection for one round of selection. So over here, if we've got this level of accuracy for trait 2, this level of accuracy for trait 1, one round of selection generates a response of 29 cents, $0.29. And the shading is simply to show that the darker green area is the best, highest results, down here is the poorest. But the point is, it's all combinations of accuracy, or a surface of all combinations of accuracy for the two traits. That's just to show the point that it's a surface. I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's basically the vertical axis is the value of response. I'll drill into some of the features of that surface. This is quite a busy slide, but I can summarise the main points of it for you. All I've done is work out that table of responses and then turned it into the profit from commercial production at each of 3 scales of production. So that's 500,000 animals a year, 1 million animals a year, or 2.5 million animals a year. I've done it at 3 correlations between the two traits, 0.5, 0 and minus 0.5. And I'll just concentrate on one column basically in the first instance. This is at the lowest commercial scale, assuming that the more expensive trait now is costing us $25 to record. When the genetic correlation is 0.5, the maximum profit we can make, the highest point in that surface, if you like, is $6.25 million over the 5 years. And we get that when we've recorded 68,000 animals for trait 1 and 32,000 animals for trait 2, and with that cost of trait 2. And you can see as you go down, the maximum profit when the correlation is 0.5 is higher than that for 0 and higher than when the genetic correlation is negative. As we go across this table, the 3 big blocks, you can see that the numbers get higher because our commercial scale is higher. If we go from the first column to the second column in each block, the numbers go down a little bit because we've increased the cost of recording from trait 2 from $25 to $100. And the last thing I'll concentrate on this slide is that you can see that the number of records we will collect for trait 2, which is our hard to measure trait, varies according to the correlation between the two traits. Once they're negatively correlated, it's worth our while to record more animals for trait 2 in order to get the gains in trait 2. And secondly, as our commercial scale gets bigger, you can see that this block is lower than this block, which is lower than this block. So the level of investment in our expensive trait will go up as commercial scale goes up, but it will drop as the cost of recording trait 2, the hard to measure trait, increases. So here, 32 down to 1,000 animals, 64,000 animals down to 6, and so on. So the optimum level of recording of our hard to measure trait depends on the genetic correlation between the traits, it depends on the commercial scale, and it depends on the cost of recording trait 2. Now that's a lot of stuff to digest, so I've tried to think about ways to show that a little bit more clearly. First of all, the effective scale is pretty simple. This is just the scale in commercial animals per year across the bottom, and this is our maximum profit over 5 years. And you can see if we just concentrate on the line, the blue line, which is for the situation where we've got a genetic correlation of 0.5 and the hard to measure traits costing us $25, the maximum profit in that scenario is this blue line here. If we increase the cost of trait 2, the hard to measure trait, to $100 for the same situation, then this is the dotted line here. And so you can see the maximum profit is lower, but it's still rising as the commercial scale goes up. And you can see that it's basically the same pattern for, this is the correlation is 0, and this is genetic correlation is minus 0.5. So in all situations, the maximum profit increases, the maximum profit we can achieve increases with commercial scale. Increasing the cost of recording trait 2 reduces that maximum profit, but it's still going up. To show that another way and to bring out a couple more points, what I've done now is plot the maximum profit in each scenario, or the profit in each scenario, against the level of investment that we're making, the total level of investment in recording. I've got it for the 3 situations of genetic correlation. This is now when they're positively correlated, 0, and negative genetic correlation. And to make that a little bit easier, so we've got 3 curves basically, and we can see that as we increase our level of investment, in each case you get some increase in the maximum profit, but then at some point it starts declining. And to make that a little easier to see, I've simply fitted a curve to it. The curve, there's no special significance to the curve, it's just to make it a little bit easier to see what we're looking at. I'll look at the orange situation here, which is for when the traits are positively genetically correlated. And what we actually see is, if we start at this end, it's easier to show. We can see we've got a little curve there, and then another little curve there, and another little curve there. What this represents is the highest level of investment in trait 2. So this is when we're recording something like 128 or 130,000 animals for trait 2. This is about 64,000 animals recorded for trait 2, 32, and so on. So there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think there's 7 of these sort of curves. And the differences between them reflect the level of investment in trait 2. If we look at this little series of dots here, they simply reflect the different levels of recording in trait 1, which is much, much cheaper. So we're seeing that effect, and we get a maximum at intermediate levels of trait 1. So that little curve is trait 1, there's the change in trait 1, same there, and so on. But the difference between this and this is the level of recording for trait 2. And you can see that, as I said, you get some increase in maximum profit as we increase our level of investment, particularly when the genetic correlation is 0 or negative between the 2 traits. It pays to increase the level of investment in trait 2. It still does even when they're positively correlated, but it's more marked when they're not so strongly favourably related. It's worth our while to increase the level of investment in trait 2 in order to maximise profit in that system. Okay, to finish this point off, I just added another situation where we've got a trait which is kind of like methane. I've called it very hard to measure. It's costing $100 per record in this case, and it's got very high economic value, but it's favourably genetically correlated with our easy to measure traits, and that's this line here. And so you can see that we get our maximum profit when we're making quite substantial investment in that hard to measure, in that very hard to measure trait. But again, where the optimum is, depends on the value of the trait and the cost of recording it. So that's been about levels of investment and returns. I just want to spend a few moments on how we might fund the phenotyping, because remember I said that we can, genomic selection allows us to decouple recording from the selection effort. So I think it's possible to imagine that there are going to be some enterprises, some breeders who will provide phenotypes, and those phenotypes are very likely to vary in cost and accuracy, because some people will do a really good job on a big scale and some people will do a poorer job on a different scale. But there'll be enterprises that provide phenotypes to the evaluation. The accuracy that I'm talking about, remember, is for the breeding objective. And in some of these enterprises that do phenotyping, there will also be genotyping. In some of them there should be, because because they've got animals that will help us with our genomic selection. But the point here is that there will be some enterprises that provide phenotypes, and they will almost certainly vary in the value of those phenotypes, and some of them will come with genotypes. So this group is our reference population. And there'll be other enterprises who will genotype but will not do any phenotyping. Now, I'm sure this is pretty widely understood that once you've got this situation set up, there's an opportunity for free riding. These people are spending money, or they're investing labour and cash in getting phenotypes. These people are just getting genotypes, and so they get the accuracy that's being generated up here, so you've got a free riding issue. I've tried to come up with a way of sharing those costs that basically gets rid of the free riding problem, and the way I do it is by aiming to equalise return on investment for all players. And the return on investment, is my definition, is the amount of accuracy you get for an animal divided by the cost to get it. And the cost could be phenotyping or genotyping or a combination of the two. I've come up with a simple example of this based on beef in Australia. It really is very simple, but the method, I believe, is quite powerful. Over here, I've got people who are doing phenotyping. They are obviously buckets, but you'll see why they're buckets in a second. But they vary, and the size of the buckets is meant to indicate they vary in basically the value of the phenotypes they're providing. And so each of the types of recorders, we can work out the accuracy that they're contributing, which is the R, and we can work out the cost of their recording. Now they contribute data into the reference population. Looks like a wishing well, but it's actually the source of all goodness, the reference population. So these blue arrows are the accuracy that's being contributed by the phenotypes being collected over here. Over here, we have people who are just going to genotype, and when they do that, they're going to get some accuracy, which is the R they get, and they're going to pay something for it. And they get that from the reference population, which is what this arrow reflects. And what I've tried to work out is, how much should we collect from these people? That's what this is. It's a levy or a royalty. How much should we collect, return to the pool, if you like, to equalise accuracy per dollar for everybody? And you can think of these as contributors and drawers, and the wishing well is the reference population. I've worked this out, as I said, for a beef example in Australia. We've got a reference population of 1,100 animals. The genotyping, so there's 1,100 animals being recorded across here. Down here, we've got a genotype only population of 12,500, and the accuracy of our contributors varies. These people are contributing 20%, 38%, 55%. Their recording costs $50, $85 and $173 per animal. So, and I modelled that by adding, these people are recording more traits, including, I think from memory, feed intake. These people are doing the carcass ultrasound traits. These are doing some weaning weights. And the solution to the equalising the costs for everybody is to levy everyone over here $3.39 per record, per animal genotyped, that's returned here. And from that, These people get basically a rebate of $28, these people get a rebate of $43, and these people get a rebate of $113. And that equalises the costs between everybody. Off, the main messages I think from all this thinking is, first of all, it's worth calculating the returns that you're going to get from a phenotyping effort in order to optimise the level and the trait allocation of phenotyping. And you can apply this to anything. The solution to that optimisation depends on the genetic parameters, the relative economic values, the recording costs, and also the scale. You have to define the breeding objective in dollar terms because it ultimately determines the economic value of accuracy and hence of phenotypes. So breeding objective, the breeding goal if you like, definition of it becomes absolutely essential, and the scale really, really affects the optimum as well. And it's worth considering how can you invest to grow that scale. Just two last slides now. First of all, it's very, very clear that phenotyping hard to measure traits can be profitable over a wide range of parameters. There's no question about that. A second point, if you think about it, selecting on hard to measure traits will boost the value of selection, and that in turn should make it easier to fund phenotyping. It's possible to come up with a way of putting a levy or a royalty on genotyping to share the costs around, and you can make it's nice and simple and equitable and efficient, and it can be relatively cheap. You can see the example I've got there. Incidentally, you can incorporate market failure and signals into that model relatively simply. The key challenge for organisations, and those might be breeds or they might be genetic evaluation platforms, for instance, genetic evaluation centres, is to maximise the amount of accuracy available to users per dollar. That's what makes it attractive to be involved in genomic selection, is you're going to get accuracy for your dollar. And just to remind the point that accuracy for the objective is actually the basic currency we're talking about here. That's what determines how much progress we can make. So that's the main points. Very, very quickly, I just outline something that is possibly it's not unique to Australia, but it's certainly part of our R&D funding model. It certainly applies to beef and sheep and some other industries. We have a system of collecting a levy on production. There's various ways of doing that, but it's similar to what I think you have in some aspects or some areas in the States. A check-off, there's a link to describing how it's done in the meat industry, and that levy is collected for industry information, industry marketing, and industry R&D, and where it's collected for R&D, it's matched by a federal government up to a particular level. And those funds that are collected through this model are invested in a range of things, but in genetics it's been invested in development of methods and tools, and also into the establishment of reference populations, where there's now some continuing co-investment with at least the breeds that are involved. Thank you.
All right. We appreciate Rob for taking the time to put this presentation together. I hope everybody can appreciate a bit, because I mean, we've had a lot of discussion in the past about that, and I know we as extension specialists have continued to encourage producers to please continue to send in phenotypes along with the genotypes. There's no model that works if we're totally dependent on the genotyping, and if we get it out of kilter and we have too many people that are the freeloaders, as Rob referred to them, then the system is going to break down. And I appreciate the thoughts that Rob has put into thinking about at least a mechanism, a possibility of trying to think about some ways to get those funded. In the U.S., I think we are at a bit of a disadvantage compared to where they are in Australia as well, in terms of the limitations that our checkoff has compared to some of the things they're able to do with the checkoff there in Australia. But if anybody has any specific questions for Rob, you can send them to him directly, and we'll be working with Rob to try and get some of that information back out if some good stimulating questions come along. Let me see. Looks like I have a question here that goes back to Kelli. So the first question that we have, Kelli, is, are you back with us? Let me make sure we've got Kelli.
Yep,
there you are.
I'm here.
Okay,
Yep.
good deal. So how will you handle donor cows?
Yeah, with the donor cow piece, that's kind of that censoring piece that we're looking at. There's basically one of two ways, right? She either gets thrown out of the evaluation or you can try to censor her. And so that's back to with the cumulative calf model. We're still wrestling with that one a little bit. Trying to make sure that we represent her in the best capacity possible.
Okay. And another question is if animals are culled for performance, how would you account for the covariance with growth traits? Yeah.
And actually, Matt and I were chatting a little bit about that one. And to be honest, we don't have a great way that we can do it right now, especially trying to fit in a covariance inside of that model. I mean, the random regression model is so big as it is, and then to try to put in and do a correlated trait type model just really isn't feasible. Or just doesn't quite frankly work. And so that is something that we are kind of battling from that standpoint as well. So not an easy trait, right, Darrh, as everybody knows. So.
Nope, absolutely. But I appreciate the effort. I think that I've said publicly many times, I think that's been our biggest failing, is that we haven't delivered on some great reproductive type EPDs, and I'm glad the associations are all putting a lot of effort into getting that done, because I think we all understand the economic importance of it, and so appreciate what you guys are doing on that.
Yeah, well, appreciate that. We could probably have a whole symposium on functional longevity with everyone on this call for about a day, and maybe not have all the problems solved, but.
Well, to be honest, Kelli, and it was a little before your time, but when the NBCC was going strong, we did a full 2-day symposium on reproductive traits and trying to just come up with exactly which traits should we be trying to chase and all. And I can tell you that we had a lot of great discussion, a lot of good minds were in that 2-day symposium. And to be honest, we came out of there with not much better than we went in with. So it's a challenge, and so but it's one worth taking on, and I think we've got to continue those efforts. Does anybody else have anything? How about my partners, Weber, Spangler, anything from you guys? Let me advance and make sure everybody knows where we're going next week. Next week, Dr. Spangler is going to be hosting, and the overall topic is advancing cattle management and selection through technology. We have Dr. Juan Pedro Stable and Dr. Mike McNeil on next week, and I hope everybody will join us as we continue this pursuit of trying to keep you guys up to date on the newest technologies. Unless I see any more comments, questions, really quick, we're over time already, and we're going to call it to an end. But appreciate everybody joining, and look forward to seeing you next week.